The First Altars, Paleolithic Beginnings, and the Birth of Ritual, tonight, and before the first stone was ever laid for a temple, and long before the first word was scratched into clay, the human spirit was already reaching out to the unseen. We often wonder, when did we first begin to believe that the world was alive with more than just flesh and bone? To find the roots of what we now call paganism, we must look not to the written record, but to the echoes left in the deep silence of the earth and the shadows of the cave. The air inside the cavern is thick and cool, smelling of damp limestone and the sharp metallic tang of iron oxide. Outside, the world is locked in the grip of the great ice, a landscape of blinding whites and lethal blues where the wind howls like a wounded beast across the tundra. But here, in the flickering amber glow of a torch made of animal fat and juniper, the darkness is pushed back. A hand stained red with ochre reaches out toward the undulating wall of the cave. The light dances, and for a moment the stone itself seems to breathe. As the artist presses their palm against the cold surface, blowing a cloud of pigment around their fingers, they leave a ghost of themselves behind. Beside them, the charcoal outline of a massive bison takes shape, its hump arching into a natural fold of the rock, giving it the illusion of muscle and life. In this flickering half-light, the beast is not merely a painting. It is a presence, a spirit summoned from the heart of the mountain to ensure the survival of the tribe. This story, the story of paganism, is fundamentally a story about the relationship between humanity and the natural world. In its most ancient form, this relationship was defined by a concept we now call animism. It is the belief that every river, every mountain, every ancient oak, and every animal possesses a soul or a vital essence. For our Paleolithic ancestors, there was no distinction between the natural and the supernatural. The world was a singular breathing tapestry of power. To hunt a deer was to enter into a ritual contract with the spirit of the deer. To gather berries was to accept a gift from the Earth Mother. This was a spirituality of participation rather than observation, a way of being that saw the human soul as a small interconnected thread in a much larger living web. What drove these early humans to crawl miles into the lightless depths of the earth to create art that few would ever see? Archaeological discoveries at sites like Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain suggest that these caves were the world's first cathedrals. The paintings were not merely decorative, they were functional. They were a form of sympathetic magic, an attempt to influence reality through ritual representation. By capturing the image of the mammoth or the horse, the Paleolithic shaman sought to capture its essence, perhaps to ask for its permission to be hunted or to ensure its fecundity. There is a profound emotional weight in these spaces, a sense of awe at the power of the wild. It reflects a time when humanity viewed itself not as the master of nature, but as its humble, often vulnerable student. As we move through the long, slow millennia of the Stone Age, we see the emergence of specific archetypes that would later populate the pantheons of the Greeks, the Celts, and the Norse. One of the most striking is the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel, a figurine carved from mammoth ivory nearly 40,000 years ago. Standing only a foot tall, it depicts a human body topped with the head of a cave lion. This artifact represents a seismic shift in human consciousness, the ability to imagine something that does not exist in the physical world, a hybrid of human intelligence and animal ferocity. It is perhaps our first glimpse of a deity, a being that transcends the boundaries of species embodying the raw power of the predator. While the spirits of the hunt dominated the masculine sphere of early ritual, another equally powerful force was being honored in the hearth and the home. Throughout Europe and Eurasia, archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of small, faceless figurines known as Venus statues. The most famous, the Venus of Willendorf, is a tiny limestone carving of a woman with exaggerated features, swelling breasts, a rounded belly, and thick thighs. She has no face, her head covered by what might be braided hair or a knit cap. These figures were not meant to be portraits of individuals. They were icons of the Great Mother. They represented the miraculous power of birth and the mystery of the female body, which mirrors the cycles of the earth itself. Just as the earth grows green in the spring and retreats in the winter, the woman's body brought forth life from the void. This reverence for the feminine principle is one of the oldest and most enduring hallmarks of pagan traditions, a recognition that the source of all life is a mother who both gives and takes away. How did these isolated tribes maintain such a consistent spiritual vision across vast distances? The answer lies in the stars and the seasons. Even in the Paleolithic humans were keen observers of the cosmic clock. They tracked the phases of the moon on bone batons and noted the shifting position of the sun. This was the birth of the wheel of the year, the understanding that time is not a straight line leading to an ending, but a circle that repeats forever. This cyclical view of time provided a sense of security in an unpredictable world. If the sun died every evening, it was certain to be reborn in the morning. If the plants withered in the frost, they were sure to return when the light lengthened. This rhythm became the heartbeat of pagan ritual, the celebration of the solstices, the equinoxes, and the seasonal transitions that govern the life of every living thing. By the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE, the human spirit had already laid the foundation for every complex religion that would follow. We had developed the concepts of sacrifice, of the afterlife, of sacred space, and of the shaman, the bridge builder between the physical and spiritual realms. We had learned to use symbols to communicate with the infinite. The transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic, the transition from the hunter to the farmer, would eventually change the names of the gods and the shape of the altars. But the core impulse remained the same, a deep-seated need to find meaning in the wind, the soil, and the stars. As the glaciers began their slow retreat and the world grew warmer, the vast herds of reindeer and mammoth moved north or faded into extinction. The humans who followed them found themselves in a changing landscape, one where the forest gave way to the meadow, and the wandering path gave way to the tilled field. The old spirits of the deep cave were about to step out into the sunlight of the first villages. The hunt was ending, and the era of the harvest was about to begin. The spirits of the wild would soon become the gods of the grain, and the first great civilizations were waiting just over the horizon. The Fertile Crescent, gods of city and soil in Mesopotamia. The transition from the wandering trail to the permanent hearth was not merely a change in geography, it was a revolution of the soul. For thousands of years, the divine had been found in the fleeting shadow of a stag or the hidden depths of a cave. But as the ice retreated and the sun warmed the valleys of the Tigris and the Euphrates, a new contract was signed between humanity and the earth. The morning mist clings to the reeds along the riverbank, a thick silver shroud that blurs the line between the water and the sky. In the distance, the first rays of the sun catch the high mud-brick walls of Uruk, turning the sun-dried clay into the color of beaten gold. A farmer stands at the edge of his field, his feet sinking into the cool, dark silt left behind by the seasonal flood. He holds a copper sickle in one hand and a small clay figurine of a seated woman in the other. He watches the horizon with a mixture of hope and dread. Will the river stay within its banks this year, bringing life-giving moisture, or will it roar forth in a chaotic deluge, swallowing his home and his children? He whispers a prayer to Enlil, the lord of the storm, and presses the figurine into the soft mud, a small, desperate anchor in an unpredictable world. This transition into the Neolithic and the subsequent rise of the first city-states represents a fundamental shift in the pagan experience. In the wild, the spirits were everywhere and nowhere fluid and elusive. But in the Fertile Crescent, the gods began to take on names, hierarchies, and permanent residences. This was the birth of the ziggurat, the man-made mountain. These massive stepped structures were designed to bridge the gap between the mundane world and the celestial realm. At the summit lived the god not as a metaphor, but as a literal inhabitant who required feeding, clothing, and the constant attention of a professional priesthood. The Mesopotamian pantheon was a direct reflection of the environment that birthed it. Unlike the predictable cycles of the Nile in Egypt, the rivers of Mesopotamia were violent and capricious. Consequently, the gods of the Sumerians and Babylonians were often seen as volatile and easily angered. At the head of this divine assembly stood Anu, the sky father, remote and immense. Beside him was Enlil, the god of air and storms whose word could level cities, and Enki, the clever god of the sweet waters and wisdom who saved humanity from the great flood. This trinity of power mirrored the tripartite nature of the Mesopotamian world, the vast sky above the turbulent air between, and the life-giving but mysterious waters below. As society became more complex, so too did its theology. The rise of the city-state introduced the concept of the patron deity. Every city, be it Eridu, Nippur, or Babylon, was considered the private estate of a specific god. The people were not merely citizens, they were the laborers of the divine. This created a social structure where the king or lugal served as the intermediary, the great man, who ensured that the city's service to its god was impeccable. If the crops failed or a plague struck, it was seen as a sign that the god had abandoned their house, perhaps because the rituals had been performed incorrectly, or the people had grown too noisy. This theology of noise is a recurring theme in Mesopotamian myth, where the gods attempt to wipe out humanity simply because their clamor prevents the divine from sleeping. It reveals a paganism of profound humility, where humans were but a small part of a vast, often indifferent, cosmic bureaucracy. Central to this spiritual landscape was Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the Queen of Heaven, and the goddess of both love and war. She is perhaps the most complex figure in ancient history, a deity who defied the traditional boundaries of gender and morality. She was the morning and evening star, the force of desire that drove animals to mate, and the rage that drove men to battle. Her famous descent into the underworld is one of the world's oldest and most profound myths of transformation. To rescue her lover Dumuzid, she must pass through 7 gates, stripping away her crown, her jewelry, and her clothing at each one, until she stands naked and powerless before her sister Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Dead. This story was not just a narrative, it was a roadmap for the seasonal cycles of the earth. When Inanna was in the underworld, the world turned gray and sterile. When she returned, the green life returned with her. Through Ishtar, the ancient Mesopotamians grappled with the duality of nature, its capacity for incredible beauty, and its terrifying destructive power. They recognized that the sacred was not always good in a moral sense, but was always powerful. To be a pagan in this era was to navigate this power with caution and respect, using ritual to maintain a fragile peace with the forces of the universe. As the centuries turned, the simple village shrines grew into the sprawling temple complexes of Babylon. Here the priests became the world's first astronomers. They mapped the movements of the planets, believing them to be the literal footsteps of the gods across the dark velvet of the night. They understood that the heavens and the earth were mirrored. What happened in the stars would inevitably manifest in the clay. This gave rise to the first systems of astrology and divination, as humans sought to read the handwriting of the gods in the livers of sacrificed sheep or the flight of birds. It was an early attempt at science born from a deeply pagan desire to find order within the chaos. The legacy of Mesopotamia to the history of paganism is the shift from the individual shaman to the collective ritual. It established the idea that the divine is a partner in the building of civilization. The gods were no longer just found in the forest. They were the architects of law, the patrons of the forge, and the masters of the counting house. They were the silent partners in every contract and the invisible generals in every war. The sacred had moved into the city, but it had lost none of its ancient wild mystery. Yet while the great ziggurats dominated the skyline, a different kind of divinity was being nurtured to the west, along the banks of a river that flowed through a desert of red sand. There the gods would take on shapes that were half human and half beast, and the focus of the spirit would turn toward the eternal horizon of the afterlife. The chaotic storms of Enlil were about to give way to the golden, unchanging light of the sun god Ra. The Pharaoh's horizon, divinity, and the cosmic order of Egypt. The world of the ancient Near East was one of turbulence and shifting sands, but to the south, protected by the vast reaches of the Sahara, a different kind of sacred vision took root. Here the divine was not a chaotic storm to be appeased, but a rhythmic, eternal pulse that beat in time with the rising and falling of a single mighty river. The silence of the pre-dawn desert is absolute, a cold indigo weight that presses down upon the dunes. Along the banks of the Nile, the papyrus reeds stand motionless, their feathered heads bowed in the gloom. Suddenly, a sliver of fire breaks the eastern horizon. As the sun climbs the limestone casing of the Great Pyramid at Giza, catches the light reflecting a brilliance so intense it seems to burn with its own internal flame. A priest clad in pleated white linen and smelling of frankincense stands on the temple roof. He raises his arms and chants the opening lines of the hymn to the sun, welcoming the return of Ra. Below him, the river, the black blood of Egypt, swirls with life, carrying the silt that will turn the desert green. In this moment, there is no doubt in the priest's mind. The universe is a machine of perfect divine clockwork, and he is its humble caretaker. This sense of cosmic permanence is the heart of Egyptian paganism, defined by the concept of Ma'at. Often translated as truth, justice, or balance, Ma'at was more than a moral code. It was the fundamental law of physics and spirit combined. It was the opposite of Isfet or chaos. To the Egyptian, the gods were the guardians of this balance, and the pharaoh was the living bridge who ensured that Ma'at prevailed over the encroaching darkness of the desert. This was a religion of profound optimism, built on the belief that If the rituals were maintained and the heart remained light, life would continue forever, both in this world and the next. The Egyptian pantheon is perhaps the most visually striking in all of pagan history, characterized by its zoomorphic deities. These were not merely animal-headed gods in a literal sense. They were symbolic representations of divine attributes. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, was the patron of embalming because the jackal was a creature that prowled the edge of the desert, and the necropolis a guardian of the threshold. Sekhmet, the lioness, embodied the scorching, destructive heat of the sun and the ferocity of the plague, while Bastet, the cat, represented the protective, nurturing warmth of the hearth. These forms reminded the devotee that the divine was present in the wild instinct of the beast as much as in the intellect of the human. Central to the Egyptian soul was the myth of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, a story of death-resurrection and the triumph of the rightful heir. Osiris, the first king and the god of vegetation, was murdered and dismembered by his brother, Set, the god of storms and the Red Desert. Isis, the great enchantress and devoted wife, gathered his pieces from across the land, breathing life back into him, just long enough to conceive their son, Horus. Osiris then became the lord of the underworld, while Horus reclaimed the throne of the living. This myth provided the template for the Egyptian view of the afterlife. Death was not an end, but a transition, a journey through the Duat, the realm of shadows, where the soul would eventually face the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Truth, the deceased's heart was placed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy with sin and chaos, it was devoured by Ammit, the eater of the dead, and the soul ceased to exist, the ultimate pagan nightmare of non-being. But if the heart was as light as the feather, the soul was welcomed into the field of reeds, a celestial version of Egypt, where the crops grew tall and the river never ran dry. This focus on the afterlife led to the development of the most sophisticated funerary technology in human history. Mummification was not an act of vanity. It was a religious necessity to preserve the kat, or physical body, so that the ka vital essence and the bia personality could find their way back to it. The daily life of a common Egyptian was saturated with this magic, or heka. While the high priests performed secret rituals in the dark, holy of holies of the great temples at Karnak or Luxor, the ordinary farmer carried amulets of the eye of Horus for protection, or the Ankh for life. Religion was not something practiced once a week. It was the act of planting grain, the brewing of beer, and the naming of children. The gods were neighbors. They lived in the statues within the local shrines. They moved in the shadows of the crocodiles in the river. They spoke in the rustle of the wind through the palms. As the Middle and New Kingdoms flourished, the theology became increasingly sophisticated. The god Amun, the hidden one of Thebes, was merged with the sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, a supreme solar deity who was both immanent in nature and transcendent beyond the stars. This period even saw a brief radical departure toward monotheism under the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who abolished the old gods in favor of the Aten, the physical disk of the sun. Yet this pagan monotheism was short-lived. Upon Akhenaten's death, the people eagerly returned to the ancient pantheon. The Hidden One and the Lady of Magic were too deeply woven into the soil of the Nile to be discarded. The Egyptian legacy is one of architectural and spiritual grandeur. They built not just for their own time, but for eternity, believing that by carving the names of the gods into granite, they were anchoring the world against the forces of decay. Their temples were models of the universe, The floors represented the marshy earth. The columns were carved like lotus and papyrus, and the ceilings were painted with the stars of the goddess Nut, who arched over the world each night to swallow the sun and give birth to it again at dawn. However, as the centuries wore on the isolation of the Nile Valley began to crumble. To the north, across the great green sea, a new culture was rising, one that would take the ancient mysteries of the East and infuse them with a restless, humanistic energy. The stoic, eternal gods of Egypt were about to meet the vibrant, quarreling, and deeply human deities of the Aegean. The sun was setting on the pharaohs, and the dawn of Olympus was at hand. The thunder of Olympus, the Greek vision of the divine. The eternal sun-drenched stability of Egypt provided a foundation for the sacred, but as we move north across the Mediterranean to the rugged crags and wine-dark seas of Greece, the divine undergoes a startling transformation. Here the gods descended from their remote heights and took on the faces, the passions, and even the flaws of humanity. The Greek spirit did not seek to escape the human condition through religion. It sought to elevate it. The air on the slopes of Mount Olympus is thin and sharp, carrying the scent of wild thyme and scorched pine. Far below the Aegean Sea is a sheet of hammered silver, dotted with islands that look like the backs of sleeping leviathans. A sudden crack of thunder rolls across the peaks, not the distant rumble of a summer storm, but a sharp, authoritative tectonic snap. In the sudden silence that follows, the wind picks up, swirling the mountain mist into shapes that almost look like charioteers. A traveler leaning on a staff of olive wood looks upward toward the cloud-shrouded summit. He does not cower in terror, nor does he prostrate himself in the dust. Instead, he narrows his eyes, searching for a sign, a golden eagle, or a change in the light. To him, the gods are not distant masters of a cosmic bureaucracy. They are powerful, volatile relatives who might at any moment step onto the path beside him. This is the essence of Hellenic paganism, the humanization of the infinite. While the Mesopotamians feared their gods and the Egyptians sought to mirror them, the Greeks engaged with them. The Olympian pantheon led by Zeus, the cloud-gatherer, Hera, the queen of the hearth, and Poseidon, the earth-shaker, represented the forces of nature, but they also represented the archetypes of the human psyche. Ares was not just the god of war, he was the bloodlust in a soldier's heart. Aphrodite was not just the goddess of beauty, she was the irresistible pull of desire that could topple empires. By giving these forces names and stories, the Greeks created a framework for understanding the complexities of their own nature. At the center of Greek religious life was the polis, the city-state. Religion was the glue that held the community together. To be a citizen of Athens or Sparta was to participate in the festivals, the sacrifices, and the processions that honored the city's patron deity. The Parthenon crowning the Acropolis was more than a treasury or a feat of engineering. It was the house of Athena Parthenos, the virgin goddess of wisdom and strategic war. Inside, her colossal statue, fashioned of gold and ivory, served as a physical anchor for the city's identity. When the citizens gathered for the Panathenaic festival, they were not just performing a ritual, they were reaffirming their place in the cosmic order, celebrating the victory of civilization over barbarism. Yet Greek paganism was never a monolithic creed. Alongside the public civic cults of the Olympians existed the mystery traditions, private secretive rites that offered a more personal connection to the divine. The most famous were the Eleusinian mysteries, held annually in honor of Demeter and her daughter Persephone. These rites promised the initiated a way to transcend the fear of death based on the myth of the seasons. Just as Persephone returned from the underworld each spring, the initiate believed that their soul, too, would find a path to a blessed afterlife. These mysteries were the internal life of Greek religion, a counterbalance to the grand public sacrifices of the state. The Greeks also pioneered the idea of the sacred landscape. They believed that certain places, springs, groves, or mountain passes, were inhabited by spirits known as nymphs, satyrs, or the genius loci. A traveler might stop to leave a small offering of honey or wine at a roadside shrine to Hermes, the messenger god and patron of travelers. This folk paganism was the heartbeat of daily life, turning every journey and every harvest into a series of small sacred interactions. It was a world where the boundary between the mortal and the divine was porous, where a hero might be the son of a god, and where a god might walk the earth in the guise of a beggar. Perhaps the greatest contribution of the Greek mind to the history of religion was the birth of philosophy within a pagan framework. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle did not necessarily seek to debunk the gods. They sought to find the first cause, or the logos, behind them. They moved the conversation from "what do the gods want?" to "what is the nature of the good?" This intellectual rigor transformed paganism from a collection of myths into a sophisticated system of ethics and metaphysics. Even the oracle at Delphi, where the Pythia inhaled sacred vapors to speak the words of Apollo, bore the inscription, "Know thyself." The search for the divine had become, in part, a search for the self. As the Greek world expanded under Alexander the Great, their gods traveled with them, merging with local deities across the known world. This process, known as interpretatio Graeca, saw Zeus identified with the Egyptian Amun and the Babylonian Marduk. It was the beginning of a truly international paganism, a melting pot of symbols and stories that would eventually be inherited by the rising power to the west. But while the Greeks gave the gods beauty and intellect, the Romans would give them something else: law, order, and the weight of an empire. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the Greek myths was about to be organized into the most powerful religious machine the world had ever seen. The gods were moving from the mountain peaks to the marble halls of the Senate. Pietas and the state, the contractual gods of Rome. What happens when a civilization views the divine not as a source of poetic inspiration, but as a legal partner in a binding eternal contract? In the heart of the Italian peninsula, a people arose who believed that the stability of the entire world rested not on the vagaries of faith or the warmth of emotion, but on the meticulous, scrupulous execution of ritual law. The morning air in the Forum Romanum is crisp, carrying the sharp metallic scent of the Tiber and the heavy aroma of roasting meat and salted flour. A pontifex draped in a heavy toga of purest white wool draws the hem of his garment over his head to veil his eyes from any ill-omened sight. He stands before the altar of the Temple of Vesta, his movement slow and deliberate, governed by 1,000 years of unwritten precedent. Behind him the city is beginning to wake the clatter of wooden carts on basalt paving stones, the distant shouting of merchants, the rhythmic marching of a centurion's guard. The priest holds a silver patera, pouring a slow stream of wine into the flames. He does not ask for the gods to love him, he asks for them to be satisfied. He recites the ancient formulas with legalistic precision, knowing that a single slipped syllable, a single stuttered word, would void the entire ceremony and leave the Republic vulnerable to the shadows. In this silence the Roman spirit is laid bare. Religion is not a private feeling, but a public duty, the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. This is the bedrock of Roman paganism, the concept of pietas. Unlike the modern word piety, which suggests a personal internal devotion, the Roman pietas was a social and political virtue. It was the sense of duty one owed to the gods, the state, and the family. To the Roman mind, the gods were not necessarily kind, nor were they particularly concerned with the moral purity of the individual heart. They were powerful, territorial, and deeply invested in the proper way of doing things. If the rituals were performed correctly, the gods were bound by their own nature to provide success, fertility, and victory. If the rituals failed, the contract was broken, and the city would suffer. This was a religion of the contract, a spiritual bureaucracy that mirrored the Roman genius for law and administration. While the great temples of the Capitoline Hill housed the state gods, Jupiter Optimus, Maximus Juno Regina, and Minerva, the true heart of Roman belief, beat within the home. Every Roman household was a sacred space governed by the lares and penates. The lares were the spirits of the ancestors and the guardians of the property, while the penates were the spirits of the larder, ensuring that the family never went hungry. Daily life involved small, constant interactions with these domestic spirits. A portion of every meal was tossed into the hearth fire. A garland of flowers was hung over the household shrine, or lararium, during family milestones. Even the doorway had its god Janus, the two-faced watcher of beginnings and endings. This domestic paganism created a world where the sacred was never more than an arm's length away, woven into the very fabric of the domestic economy and the continuity of the bloodline. Central to the survival of the state was the order of the Vestal Virgins. These 6 women, chosen as children from the nobility, were the only full-time professional priesthood in Rome. Their task was simple yet cosmic, to keep the eternal flame of Vesta burning in her circular temple. To the Romans, this flame was the literal soul of the city. If it went out, it was a sign that the gods had turned their backs on Rome. The Vestals lived a life of immense privilege, but were bound by a vow of absolute chastity. The stakes were terrifyingly high. A Vestal who broke her vow was seen as a source of religious pollution, so great that she could not be executed by human hands, but was instead buried alive in a subterranean chamber with a single lamp and a loaf of bread. This emotional weight, the tension between the beauty of the ritual and the brutality of the consequence, underscores the Roman belief that the safety of the millions depended on the ritual purity of the few. As Rome transitioned from a republic to a sprawling empire, its paganism proved to be remarkably flexible. When the Roman legions conquered a new land, they did not seek to destroy the local gods. Instead, they practiced a ritual called evocatio. A Roman general would stand before the walls of an enemy city and formally invite its gods to abandon their people and come to Rome, promising them better temples and greater honors. This religious absorption allowed Rome to integrate diverse cultures into a single imperial tapestry. In the forests of Gaul, they identified the local god Lugus with their own Mercury. In the deserts of Britain, the goddess Sulis became Sulis Minerva. This syncretism was the secret of Roman longevity, the ability to expand the pantheon as quickly as the borders. The climax of Roman religious architecture is found in the pantheon, the temple to all gods. Built by Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, its massive concrete dome, the largest in the world for over a millennium, was a physical representation of the heavens. The oculus, the great circular opening at the top, allowed a single beam of sunlight to move across the interior like a celestial clock, illuminating the statues of the various deities in their niches. It was a monument to the Roman ideal of a unified, ordered universe where every god had a place and every ritual had a purpose. In the pantheon, the many became one under the authority of the Roman state. However, the late empire saw a shift that would eventually challenge the foundations of this traditional paganism. The rise of the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor as a living god or a divinized being after death, transformed religion into a test of political loyalty. While most pagans found it easy to add the emperor to their list of deities, a new stubborn sect from the east refused to burn incense to the imperial image. This friction between the traditional Roman contract and the exclusive monotheism of the Christians would eventually lead to the era of the martyrs. But before that storm arrived, Roman paganism reached its most sophisticated heights, blending Greek philosophy with Roman law to create a world of ordered mystery. The legacy of Rome to the history of paganism is the concept of the sacred institution. They proved that a religion of nature and many gods could support a complex urban civilization of millions. They taught that the divine could be found in the law, the road, and the bridge, as much as in the mountain and the stream. But as the Roman roads pushed further north into the misty, untamed wilderness of the Celts and the Germans, the Roman soldiers encountered a different kind of sacred power, one that did not live in marble temples or follow written laws. The disciplined lines of the Roman legions were approaching the edge of the world. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube, the peace of the gods would meet the wild of the woods. The gods of the city were about to face the spirits of the deep oak. Under the oak, the Druids and the Celtic wild. Beyond the paved roads and structured marble of the Roman world lay a landscape that felt fundamentally different, a realm of deep mist, ancient forests and rivers that seemed to flow from the womb of the earth itself. While the Romans sought to contain the divine within law and stone, the Celts found the sacred in the raw, unmediated pulse of the wilderness. This was a world where the border between the human and the supernatural was as thin as the morning fog, and where the keepers of wisdom were not politicians, but the shadowy, revered figures known as the Druids. The twilight in the forest of Gaul is a heavy emerald gloom where the gnarled roots of ancient oaks twist like the limbs of sleeping giants. A low rhythmic chanting rises through the trees, vibrating in the damp air. In a small clearing illuminated only by the silver light of a crescent moon, a group of figures stands in a perfect circle. At the center is a man draped in a cloak of white wool, his hair long and unbound. In his hand he holds a golden sickle, its edge gleaming like a shard of the sun. He reaches upward toward a cluster of mistletoe growing high, upon an oak branch, a plant that never touches the earth, believed to be the literal seed of the gods fallen from the sky. With a single swift stroke, the mistletoe falls into a white cloth, never allowed to hit the ground. The scent of crushed herbs and damp earth is overwhelming. There are no walls here, no roof but the stars. And yet the sense of the sacred is so thick, it feels as though the very air is charged with lightning. This is the nematon, the sacred grove, where the heartbeat of the forest and the heartbeat of the tribe are one. The Celtic worldview was defined by a profound sense of place. Every spring, every hilltop, and every confluence of rivers had its own spirit, its own story, and its own name. Unlike the Romans who built temples to the gods, the Celts believed the land itself was the temple. The Druids, who served as judges, healers, and keepers of the oral tradition, were the intermediaries who translated the language of the birds, the wind, and the water for the people. Their education was legendary, often taking 20 years of memorization, for they believed that to write down the sacred mysteries was to kill their living spirit. This oral tradition ensured that their paganism remained fluid, evolving with the landscape and the needs of the community. At the core of Celtic spirituality was the triple goddess and the concept of the sacred king. The land was seen as a feminine entity, often personified as the goddess Eriu, from whom Ireland takes its name, or Brigid, the goddess of the hearth poetry and smithing. The king's primary duty was not just to lead in war, but to marry the land in a ritual known as the Hieros Gamos. If the king was just and strong, the land would be fertile. If he was weak or corrupt, the crops would wither and the cattle would die. This intimate biological link between the morality of the leader and the health of the ecosystem is one of the most powerful legacies of the Celtic mind. It reflects a society that understood it was not separate from nature, but a vital organ within it. The Celtic calendar was a wheel of fire and light, marking the points where the veil between worlds grew thin. There were 4 great festivals: Imbolc, the stirrings of spring; Beltane, the fire of summer; Lugnasad, the celebration of the harvest; and Samhain, the transition into the dark half of the year. During Beltane, great bonfires were lit on the hills, and cattle were driven between them to be purified by the smoke. At Samhain, the ancestor of our modern Halloween, the gates of the Sidi, the mounds where the spirits lived, were flung open. This was a time of both fear and reverence, a moment when the living and the dead could share a meal, and when the chaotic forces of the other world could spill over into the mundane. The gods of the Celts were as diverse and rugged as the terrain they inhabited. There was the Dagda, the good god, who possessed a cauldron that never ran empty and a club that could both kill and restore life. There was the Morrigan, the terrifying crow goddess of battle and prophecy, who washed the blood-stained clothes of those destined to die in the river. And there was Cernunnos, the horned one, often depicted sitting cross-legged among wild animals, wearing a torque and bearing the antlers of a stag. Cernunnos is perhaps the most iconic image of Celtic paganism, the lord of the wild things, representing the virility of the forest and the cycle of life, death, and regrowth. He was the mediator between the human world and the untamed deep. Archaeological finds such as the Gundestrup cauldron provide a window into this complex mythology. This silver vessel, found in a peat bog in Denmark, is decorated with scenes of gods, animals, and warriors. It depicts rituals that seem to involve both sacrifice and rebirth, reflecting a belief in the transmigration of the soul. To the Celts, death was not a final destination, but a middle of a long journey. This lack of fear regarding death made them formidable warriors, as recorded by Caesar and other Roman historians who were both fascinated and horrified by the Druids' influence over the Gallic tribes. The clash between the Roman Pax Deorum and the Celtic Wild was inevitable. To the Romans, the Druids were a dangerous political force that unified the tribes against imperial rule. Under the Emperor Claudius and later Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman state launched a systematic campaign to destroy the Druidical order. The most famous encounter occurred on the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, where Roman legionaries faced a terrifying line of Druids lifting their arms to heaven and screaming curses while black-clad women with flaming torches ran among them. The Romans eventually prevailed, cutting down the sacred groves and ending the formal power of the Druid caste. Yet, while the institutions of the Druids were dismantled, the spirit of Celtic paganism could not be so easily erased. It retreated into the folklore of the people, into the names of the hills, and into the holy wells that were later dedicated to Christian saints, but remained sites of ancient watery power. The Celts left behind a legacy of thin places locations, where the divine is felt not through a sermon or a book, but through the shiver of the leaves and the cold clarity of a spring. As the Roman Empire began its long, slow decline, and the legions withdrew from the north, another wave of pagan power was stirring in the frozen reaches of Scandinavia and Germany. The gods of the oak were about to meet the gods of the ash tree. The mist of the Celts was giving way to the ice and iron of the Norse. The world tree, Norse mythology, and the Germanic hearth. In the freezing reaches of the north where the sun disappears for months and the sea grinds against the jagged fjords like a whetstone, a different kind of paganism was forged. This was a spirituality of iron ice and unyielding courage. While the Greeks found beauty in the human form, and the Romans found order in the law, the Germanic and Norse peoples found truth in the inevitable end of all things. Theirs was a world governed not by the whims of the gods, but by the cold, impartial threads of word fate that bound both men and deities alike. The wind off the North Sea is a whetted blade carrying the scent of salt pine resin and the metallic tang of oncoming snow. In the center of a longhouse, the peat fire hurls a chaotic orange light against the soot-stained rafters. A group of warriors and weavers sits in a circle, their shadows stretching like giants against the timber walls. At the head of the hearth, an old woman, a vulva, clutches a staff carved from the wood of an ash tree. Her eyes clouded by age but sharp, with an inner light stare into the embers. She begins to chant, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that mimics the grinding of glacial ice. She speaks of Yggdrasil, the world tree, whose roots drink from the wells of wisdom and frost, and whose branches support the 9 realms of existence. As she describes the final battle of Ragnarok, the room grows silent. There is no comfort in her words, no promise of a soft paradise. Instead, there is the call to meet the darkness with a steady hand and a defiant heart. In this flickering warmth, the Northmen learn that while the gods may fall and the world may burn, the glory of a life well lived is a flame that the frost can never extinguish. At the center of this cosmic vision stood Yggdrasil, the massive ash tree that connected the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. This was not a static symbol. It was a living, suffering organism, constantly gnawed by the dragon Nidhogg at its roots and browsed by hearts among its leaves. This imagery reflected the Norse understanding of the universe as a fragile balance always under threat from the forces of chaos, the giants, or Jötnar. To be a pagan in the Norse tradition was to be a soldier in a cosmic holding action, helping the gods delay the inevitable collapse of the order. The pantheon was divided into 2 main groups, the Aesir, the gods of war, sky, and sovereignty, and the Vanir, the older, more mysterious deities of fertility, sea, and magic. At the pinnacle sat Odin, the All-Father. He was not a king in the Roman sense, but a restless, terrifying seeker of knowledge. He was the god of the hanged, the god of poetry, and the god of the frenzy. Odin's character defines the Norse soul. He sacrificed his eye to Mimir's well for wisdom, and hung himself from the world tree for 9 days, pierced by a spear to win the secret of the runes. Beside him stood Thor, the protector of Midgard, the human world. With his hammer, Mjolnir Thor was the champion of the common farmer, a thunderous force of strength against the giants of the wilderness. Equally vital were the goddesses who commanded the most fundamental forces of life. Freya of the Vanir was the mistress of love beauty, and Satyr a form of shamanic magic that could see and weave the threads of fate. She claimed half of those slain in battle, taking them to her field Folkvanger, mirroring the role of the Valkyries who brought the other half to Odin's Valhalla. This highlights a society where the masculine and feminine were seen as two sides of a sharpened blade, both necessary for the survival of the tribe in a brutal climate. Norse paganism was deeply rooted in the hearth and the thing, the household, and the legal assembly. While there were great temples, such as the legendary Gilded Hall at Uppsala in Sweden, most worship was local and private. It happened at the Herger, a simple altar of piled stones, or in the sacred grove. Rituals known as blots involved the sacrifice of animals and the sharing of ale, creating a sacred contract of hospitality between the gods and the community. To the Norsemen, the gods were full trui, fully trusted friends, with whom one shared the feast and the fight. Archaeological discoveries like the Oseberg ship burial reveal the immense importance of the journey after death. The Norse believed the soul required the same tools in the next world as it did in this one, ships, horses, weapons, and even household sleds. This was not a religion of sin and salvation, but one of honor and shame. The goal was to leave behind a good name that would live on in the songs of the Skalds, for as the Havamal, the sayings of the High One states, cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself must die, but the fame of the man who wins it never dies. This ethos reached its peak in the myth of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Unlike many other religions that promise a final victory of good over evil, the Norse predicted a final defeat. The sun would be swallowed by a wolf, the great serpent would poison the sea, and Odin, Thor, and the other gods would fall in battle against the monsters of the void. Yet even in this absolute destruction, there was a seed of hope. The myth tells of a new earth rising from the waters, green and fair, where a new generation of gods and two human survivors would begin the cycle anew. This cyclical view of time, shared with their Celtic and Greek cousins, provided a sense of eternal recurrence that made the hardships of the North bearable. As the Viking Age surged forward, the Norse gods traveled on the dragon ships to the coasts of England, France, and even the Mediterranean. They met the White Christ of the southern lands, and for centuries the two faiths existed in a tense, often violent but sometimes creative synthesis. A warrior might wear a cross and a hammer on the same chain, hedging his bets between the new god of peace and the old gods of war. But the tide was turning. The organized, literate, and centrally governed power of the Christian Church was moving north, carrying a worldview that could not tolerate the wild, decentralized, and pluralistic nature of the old ways. The world tree was about to face the cross. The age of the country dweller, the Paganus, was about to begin in earnest, as the old gods retreated from the halls of kings into the shadows of the folk soul. The great shift, the word, the cross, and the country dweller. The grand architectures of the Old World, the Ziggurats of Sumer, the pyramids of the Nile, and the marble temples of the Mediterranean had stood for millennia as the anchors of human spirit. But as the Roman Empire groaned under its own weight, and the wild tribes of the north began to settle into kingdoms, a new force arrived. It was not a force of many faces, but of one. Not a religion of the landscape, but a religion of the book. This was the moment the many met the one. And the very name of the ancient ways was born from the dust of the rural roads. The sun sets behind a low rolling ridge in the late Roman provinces of Gaul, casting long bruised shadows across a small cluster of stone huts. The village is quiet save for the rhythmic thud of a pestle and the distant bleating of goats. At the edge of a tilled field an old farmer kneels before a rough-hewn stone pillar, its surface worn smooth by the touch of generations. He pours a small measure of oil into a natural depression at the top, whispering a prayer to the genius of the field, the spirit that ensures the wheat will rise. He does not know that in the gleaming cities of the coast, the temples have been closed by imperial decree. He does not know that the gods he serves are now called demons by men in silken robes. To him, the city is a distant alien world of politics and change. Here in the Pagus, the countryside, the old rhythms of the earth remain. He is a paganus, a country dweller, and his faith is as deep and stubborn as the roots of the oak. The word pagan was originally a term of dismissal, even an insult, derived from the Latin paganus, meaning rustic or civilian. It was used by early Christians to describe those who remained outside the army of Christ. While the urban elites and the military commanders began to adopt Christianity for reasons of statecraft and soul-searching, the rural populations clung to their local shrines and seasonal rituals. To be a pagan was to be behind the times, a holdout of the old world. Yet this linguistic shift reveals a fundamental truth about the history of religion. As the official state cults collapsed, the ancient ways retreated to the earth, becoming folk traditions that were inseparable from the land itself. The transition from the pluralistic world of paganism to the exclusive world of the Abrahamic faiths was not a sudden event, but a slow, agonizing erosion that lasted centuries. It was a clash of two entirely different ways of perceiving reality. For the pagan, the divine was immanent. It lived inside the tree, the river, and the stone. For the Christian, the divine was transcendent. It lived outside and above the world, having created it, but remaining separate from it. This shift had profound implications for how humans treated the environment. If a grove was no longer the home of a god, it could be cut down. If a spring was no longer a deity, it was merely a resource. The process of Christianization often involved the strategic repurposing of pagan space. This was famously articulated by Pope Gregory the Great. In his instructions to missionaries in Britain, do not destroy the temples, he advised, but purify them. Sprinkle them with holy water, place altars and relics within them, and let the people continue to gather there. If they were used to sacrificing oxen to their gods, let them now slaughter the oxen for a feast in honor of a saint. This led to a fascinating period of syncretism where the lines between the old and new faiths became hopelessly blurred. The goddess Brigid became Saint Brigid. The winter solstice became Christmas. The spring fertility festivals became Easter. The pagan did not disappear. It went underground wearing a new mask. However, there was also a darker side to this shift. In the 4th century, after the conversion of Constantine, the Roman state began to actively suppress the old ways. Theodosius I issued the Theodosian decrees, which banned public pagan sacrifice and closed the ancient temples, including the eternal flame of the Vestal Virgins in Rome. The great library of Alexandria, a repository of pagan wisdom, and the Serapeum were destroyed by mobs. In the north, Charlemagne's conquest of the Saxons involved the felling of the Irminsul, a massive tree trunk that the Germanic tribes revered as a pillar of the universe. To the tribes, the destruction of the Irminsul was not just a political defeat. It was a cosmic catastrophe, a sign that the old gods had been silenced by a more powerful word. The collapse of the pagan institutions meant the loss of the formal priesthoods, the Druids, the Flamans, and the seers. Without the temples to maintain the calendars and the state to fund the great festivals, the high theology of the ancient world began to fade. What remained was the Pietas of the Hearth. The grand tradition of the philosophers became the little tradition of the peasants. People still left milk for the good folk. They still walked sunwise around holy wells, and they still believed that the wild hunt rode through the sky on stormy nights. This survival of the old ways in the form of folklore and superstition is what historians call the paganization of the Middle Ages. The shift was also one of literacy. Paganism was largely a religion of the senses, visual, tactile, and oral. Christianity was a religion of the text. As the Church established schools and monasteries, the ability to read and write became tied to the new faith. The old myths were either demonized or euhemerized, turned into stories of mortal kings and heroes rather than gods. The Norse gods were reimagined as ancient refugees from Troy. The Celtic gods became the Tuatha De Danann, a magical race of people who lived under the hills. The divine was being demoted to the status of the fairy tale. Why did it happen? Why did the ancient diverse pantheons give way to the singular God? Historians point to the social utility of a universal faith in building large centralized empires. A single God, a single law, and a single king provided a powerful framework for stability in a chaotic world. Yet the cost was the loss of the intimate local connection to the sacredness of the earth. The country dweller was now a minority in a world that was looking toward the heavens rather than the soil. But as we shall see, the roots of the world tree were deep. Though the branches were pruned and the temples leveled, the spirit of the old gods did not die. It waited in the stories told by the fire and the herbs gathered by the wise woman, and in the secret corners of the human heart that still yearned for a world that was alive and enchanted. The shadows of the Middle Ages were long, but within them the pagan heart continued to beat, hidden in plain sight. As the medieval world solidified, these echoes of the past would create a unique hybrid culture, one where the saint and the spirit lived side by side in the village mind. The old gods were not gone. They were merely sleeping in the landscape, waiting for a time when humanity would once again look to the stars and the seasons with the eyes of an ancient storyteller. Survival in the shadows, syncretism, and folk belief in the Middle Ages. The great shift had occurred. On the maps of the kings and the parchments of the bishops, Europe was now Christendom. The grand temples were ruins, and the ancient priesthoods were a memory. But if one were to step away from the cathedrals and into the small mud-walled villages where the vast majority of humanity lived, the old world had not ended. It had simply changed its clothes. The pagan spirit proved to be a master of camouflage, weaving itself so deeply into the fabric of medieval life that the line between the Christian and the heathen became a shimmering, indistinct haze. The winter air in a 12th century German village is so cold it feels brittle, cracking under the weight of a heavy gray sky. Inside a small stone cottage, the fire in the hearth is never allowed to go out. It is the living heart of the home. On the table sits a bowl of porridge placed there, not for a hungry child, but for the kobold, the unseen spirit of the house, who protects the grain and the cattle. Outside, the village church bells begin to ring for the feast of St. Nicholas, but the young men of the village are not in the pews. They are in the woods wearing masks made of bark and animal fur, their bodies wrapped in straw. They are preparing for the Perchtenlauf, a wild clattering procession to drive away the ghosts of the winter frost. They shout the name of the saint, but their movements are the movements of their ancestors from 1,000 years before. In this dim, smoky world, the priest may hold the keys to heaven, but the wise woman in the hut by the stream holds the charms for the harvest, the fever, and the protection of the soul against the hidden people of the hills. This era of the Middle Ages was defined by syncretism, the unconscious merging of different beliefs. To the medieval peasant, there was no contradiction in praying to the Virgin Mary for a soul's salvation, while simultaneously burying a lead tablet in the field to appease the spirits of the earth. This was a lived religion, pragmatic and deeply rooted in the cycles of survival. The Church, recognizing the impossibility of erasing these ancient impulses, often chose to baptize them. The holy wells of the Celts, once dedicated to water spirits, were renamed for saints. The sacred groves were replaced by chapels, but the people continued to hang cluties, scraps of cloth, representing prayers, on the nearby trees. One of the most enduring symbols of this survival is the Green Man. Found carved into the stone corbels and wooden misericords of the great Gothic cathedrals, the Green Man is a face peering through a mask of leaves or a man disgorging vines and foliage from his mouth. He is a pagan ghost in a Christian house, a representation of the unquenchable vitality of nature. While the theologians spoke of the vanity of the flesh, the Green Man reminded the commoner that the earth was alive, pulsing with a wild vegetative power that even the stone of the church could not contain. This was also the age of the wise woman and the cunning man. These were the village healers who maintained the herbal lore and the charms of the pre-Christian past. They knew which plants belonged to the sun and which to the moon. They understood the doctrine of signatures, believing that a plant's shape revealed its divine purpose. While their practices were often viewed with suspicion by the high clergy, they were essential to the community. Their magic was not a rebellion against the church, but a continuation of the pagan belief that the world was a pharmacy of spiritual forces. When a wise woman muttered a rhyme over a broken bone, she was using the same rhythmic incantatory power that the Velva or the Druid had used centuries earlier. The medieval calendar remained a pagan wheel at its heart. The 12 days of Christmas preserved the old Germanic Yule, the time of the wild hunt, and the return of the sun. May Day continued the fertility rites of Beltane, with the maypole serving as a clear phallic symbol of the earth's awakening. Even the cult of the saints functioned in a polytheistic way. Just as the ancients had a god for the forge, a god for the sea, and a god for the hearth, the medieval person had a saint for every specific need. Saint Elmo protected the sailor, Saint Apollonia cured the toothache, Saint Anthony found the lost keys. The company of saints became a new Christianized pantheon, allowing the pagan impulse for localized, specialized divinity to flourish under a different name. However, as the Middle Ages progressed, the tolerance for these superstitions began to wane. The rise of the Inquisition and the codification of canon law saw a shift from viewing folk practices as ignorant errors to viewing them as diabolical pacts. The old horned god of the woods Cernunnos or Pan was increasingly conflated with the Christian devil. The shamanic trance was reimagined as the witch's Sabbath. This was the beginning of the Great Fear, where the remnants of pagan nature worship were pushed into the realm of the forbidden. The secret knowledge of the wise woman became the heresy of the witch. Yet even under the threat of the stake, the pagan heart beat on. It survived in the mummers' plays, in the legends of Robin Hood, the King of the May, and in the fairy tales that would later be collected by the brothers Grimm. These stories of talking animals, magical woods, and transformations were the embers of a worldview that refused to see the world as a mere vale of tears. They insisted that the world was an enchanted forest filled with wonder and peril. The Middle Ages were not a void between two periods of pagan activity, but a long, slow fermentation. The old gods were not dead. They were sleeping in the hills, transformed into the kings under the mountain or the spirits of the hearth. They were waiting for a new era, not of the peasant, but of the scholar, when the ancient texts of the Greeks and Romans would be rediscovered, and the many gods would once again step into the light of the human mind. The era of the country dweller was about to meet the era of the rebirth. The shadows of the medieval forest were about to be illuminated by the intellectual fire of the Renaissance. The Renaissance of the gods, humanism, and the recovery of antiquity. For nearly 1,000 years, the gods of the ancient world had lived as ghosts, either demonized as tempters of the soul or reduced to decorative footnotes in the margins of medieval manuscripts. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, a tremor began in the city-states of Italy that would shake the foundations of Christendom. It was not a peasant revolt or a theological schism, but a rediscovery. The many gods were no longer just lingering in the folk memory of the countryside. They were being invited back into the halls of power, the libraries of scholars, and the canvases of the world's greatest artists. This was the Renaissance, the rebirth, and with it came a sophisticated intellectual revival of the pagan spirit that sought to reconcile the wisdom of the ancients with the faith of the present. The air in the private study of a Florentine nobleman is heavy with the scent of aged vellum beeswax and the faint citrusy tang of a newly peeled orange. Sunlight streams through a stained glass window, casting a mosaic of sapphire and ruby across a desk cluttered with bronze instruments and ink-stained quills. At the center of the desk lies a manuscript recently arrived from a crumbling monastery in Greece, its pages brittle, but its Greek script clear and elegant. A scholar wearing a heavy velvet robe to ward off the morning chill leans forward, his fingers trembling, as he traces the name Hermes Trismegistus. To him, this is not just a book. It is a key to a forgotten universe. Outside, the bells of the Duomo ring for the morning Mass, but inside this room the scholar is listening to a different music, the harmony of the spheres. He looks up at a bronze statue of Apollo on his shelf, and for the first time in centuries, he does not see a pagan idol. He sees an archetype of the light of human reason. The gods are returning not as objects of sacrifice, but as the crowning jewels of the human mind. This revival was driven by a movement known as Humanism. It was the belief that the literature, art, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome represented a peak of human achievement that had been lost during the Dark Ages. Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola did not seek to overthrow the Church, but they did seek to expand the boundaries of the sacred. They argued that the ancient myths were not lies, but veiled allegories of divine truth. This intellectual alchemy allowed the pagan gods to return to the mainstream of Western culture. Venus was no longer just a demon of lust. She became a symbol of divine love. Mars was no longer just a god of slaughter. He represented the fortitude of the soul. Central to this renaissance of the gods was the recovery of the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of ancient texts attributed to the legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus. These writings suggested that there was a Prisca Theologia, a primordial theology that had been revealed to the ancients and was the common root of all religions, including Christianity. This idea was revolutionary. It suggested that the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Persians had possessed a valid divine wisdom that predated the Bible. This led to a surge of interest in Neoplatonism, astrology, and alchemy, the high magic of the Renaissance. It was a form of philosophical paganism that viewed the universe as a living organism bound together by secret correspondences and planetary influences. In the world of art, this shift was visual and visceral. For centuries, art had been almost exclusively religious and two-dimensional, focusing on the suffering of Christ or the majesty of the saints. Now the human body in all its pagan muscular glory returned to the center of the frame. When Sandro Botticelli painted The Birth of Venus or Primavera, he was not just creating beautiful decorations. He was creating talismans of Neoplatonic thought. To gaze upon the beauty of the naked goddess was seen by the initiates as a way to elevate the soul toward the contemplation of divine beauty. The gods were being used as a language to describe the complexity of human emotion and the mechanics of the cosmos. Even within the Vatican itself, the old gods found a home. Pope Julius II and Pope Leo Thickes were patrons of the new learning, surrounding themselves with classical statues and commissioning frescoes that blended biblical stories with pagan mythology. Raphael's The School of Athens, painted in the heart of the Apostolic Palace, placed the pagan philosophers Plato and Aristotle at the center of the search for truth. This Christian-pagan synthesis created a unique hybrid culture where the Sibyls of the ancient world were painted alongside the prophets of the Old Testament. It was a recognition that the pagan was an essential part of the human heritage, a foundation upon which the modern world was being built. However, this intellectual paganism was a world apart from the folk paganism of the peasants. While the scholars in Florence and Venice were debating the nature of the logos, the people in the countryside were still leaving offerings at holy wells and fearing the evil eye. The Renaissance revival was an elite movement confined to the courts and universities. Yet it was crucial because it de-demonized the ancient world. It made it possible for a civilized person to admire the gods of the Greeks without fear of losing their soul. It provided the aesthetic and philosophical tools that would later allow for the birth of modern science and the Enlightenment. This era also saw the rise of the Renaissance Magus men like Agrippa von Nettesheim and John Dee, who sought to command the spirits of the stars through ritual and mathematics. They believed that by understanding the occult philosophy of the ancients, they could become masters of nature. This was a revival of the ancient pagan dream of the shaman the human as a bridge builder between the worlds. While they remained outwardly Christian, their practices were deeply rooted in the Gnostic and Hermetic traditions that the Church had spent centuries trying to suppress. But the Renaissance was not just a time of light and rediscovery. As the high magic of the scholars became more famous, it also became more dangerous. The same period that saw the painting of the Sistine Chapel also saw the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. The Church and the rising Protestant movements began to view the unregulated spiritual life of both the scholars and the peasants with increasing hostility. The many gods had returned to the light, but the one God was about to react with a series of religious wars and persecutions that would tear Europe apart. The legacy of the Renaissance to the history of paganism is the preservation of the golden chain, the continuity of ancient thought. By translating the texts and painting the myths, the Renaissance ensured that the gods of antiquity would never again be truly forgotten. They had become an indelible part of the Western imagination, waiting in the wings of history. As the fires of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation began to burn, the intellectual freedom of the Renaissance was curtailed. The dream of a universal theology faded, and the world moved toward an era of cold reason and scientific inquiry. But the seeds had been sown. The gods had been remembered, and the romantic movement of the future would eventually find in them a soul-deep connection to a nature that the new science was threatening to disenchant. The age of reason was approaching, but the pagan heart was already looking back toward the mist. The Enlightenment and the Romantic reaction. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the intellectual fires of the Renaissance had cooled into the steady clinical light of the Enlightenment. The universe, once seen as a living, breathing organism filled with spirits and planetary influences, was being reimagined as a vast, predictable machine, a clockwork of matter and motion governed by the laws of Newton. In this age of reason, the ancient gods were further demoted. They were no longer even allegories of divine truth, but mere superstitions of a primitive past. Yet as the forests were cleared for factories and the mysteries of the night were banished by the street lamp, a profound ache began to stir in the human soul. This was the birth of the Romantic movement, a passionate, defiant reaction against the disenchantment of the world, and the moment when modern paganism began to find its first self-conscious voice. The air in a London coffee house in the year 1780 is a stifling haze of tobacco smoke and the bitter roasted scent of the black drink. Outside, the cobblestones rattle with the wheels of industry, and the sky is a bruised charcoal gray from the coal fires of the new mills. Men in powdered wigs sit around a scarred wooden table, debating the rights of man and the mechanics of the steam engine. But in a quiet corner of the city, a different kind of gathering is taking place. A small group of poets and artists, led by the visionary William Blake, is looking at a series of drawings of ancient stone circles, the ruins of Stonehenge and Avebury. To them, these stones are not merely archaeological curiosities. They are the altars of the soul. They do not see a machine when they look at the world. They see a body of light that has been fettered by the mind-forged manacles of logic. They begin to speak of the Druids not as savages, but as the keepers of a lost natural wisdom. In the heart of the most rational century in history, the longing for the enchanted has returned with a vengeance. The Enlightenment sought to demythologize reality. Thinkers like Voltaire and Hume argued that religion should be based on reason rather than revelation. In this environment, the ancient pagan paths were viewed through the lens of early anthropology. They were seen as the childhood of the race. While this led to a decline in traditional religious practice, it also led to the first systematic study of world mythologies. For the first time, scholars began to compare the myths of the Greeks with the Eddas of the Norse and the Vedas of India. They were looking for the natural religion that existed before the arrival of organized dogma. Ironically, the very tools of the Enlightenment logic and historical inquiry began to uncover the vast interconnected roots of the pagan world. This scholarly curiosity was the spark for the Romantic reaction. Figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that humanity had been corrupted by civilization and that natural man was more virtuous because he lived in harmony with the earth. This return to nature became the battle cry of the 19th century Romantics. In Germany, the brothers Grimm wandered the countryside collecting the folk tales that had survived since the Middle Ages, believing they were the shattered pieces of an ancient Germanic mythology. In Britain, poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge wrote of the spirit of the place, genius loci, suggesting that a mountain or a hidden lake possessed a soul that could speak to the human heart. They were reviving the animism of the Paleolithic, but through the sophisticated lens of literature. Crucially, this era saw the first neo-Druidic revivals. Figures like Iolo Morgan W., an antiquarian and poet, claimed to have discovered ancient manuscripts detailing the secret traditions of the Welsh Druids. While much of his work was later revealed to be a brilliant literary forgery, a creative mythology, it tapped into a deep cultural need. On the autumn equinox of 1792, Morganbig held a ceremony on Primrose Hill in London using stones to mark a sacred circle. He was not just performing a play, he was attempting to re-establish a link to the pre-Christian past. This was invented tradition in its most powerful form, the use of pagan symbols to create a new national identity that bypassed the institutional church. This was also the age of the sublime. For the Enlightenment scientist, a storm was a meteorological event. For the Romantic, it was an encounter with the divine. Artists like J.M.W. Turner and Caspar David Friedrich painted landscapes where the human figure was dwarfed by the immense terrifying power of the sea and the sky. This was a pagan aesthetic, a recognition that the universe was not a well-behaved machine, but a wild, overwhelming force that commanded awe and terror. The old gods were returning not in the marble form of Greek statues, but in the raw power of the elements. However, the 19th century was also the century of the Industrial Revolution. As the Romantic poets were praising the lonely hills, those hills were being carved up for coal and iron. This created a profound sense of nostalgia, a word that literally means the pain of the return. Paganism began to be framed as the lost Eden, a golden age of ecological and spiritual harmony that had been destroyed by the dark satanic mills. This link between paganism and environmentalism, which is so central to modern practice, was forged in the fires of the 1800s. It was a spiritual protest against the commodification of the earth. As the century drew to a close, this romantic longing began to take a more organized, esoteric turn. The study of folklore and the love of nature were no longer enough for some seekers. They wanted to move beyond feeling the divine to working with it. They began to look back at the Renaissance magi and the ancient mystery cults, seeking a practical system of ritual and magic that could operate within a modern scientific world. The country dweller had become the modern urbanite, but the hunger for the sacred had not changed. The ghosts of the Druids and the whispers of the Norse gods were about to be codified into a new hidden tradition. The era of the poets was about to give way to the era of the occultists. The dawn was breaking on a revival that would finally bring the many gods into the 20th century. The Golden Dawn, the occult revival of the 19th century. As the 19th century matured, the romantic longing for the past underwent a profound transformation. The poets had felt the presence of the gods in the wind and the ruins, but a new generation of seekers was no longer content with mere feeling. They lived in an age of staggering scientific advancement, an era of steam telegraphs, and the mounting evidence of evolution, yet they felt a spiritual vacuum that neither the traditional church nor cold materialism could fill. This gave rise to the occult revival, a movement that sought to turn the ancient scattered fragments of paganism into a structured, potent, and scientific system of magic. The many gods were no longer just literary symbols. They were being summoned as living forces in the candlelit chambers of the Victorian city. The evening air in London is thick with a yellow sulphurous fog that clings to the iron railings and muffles the rhythmic clatter of hansom cabs. In a nondescript townhouse in South Kensington, a heavy mahogany door closes, sealing out the noise of the modern world. Inside the room is bathed in the scent of aged cedar and the sharp resinous smoke of Kaifi incense. A group of men and women dressed in ceremonial robes of black and gold stand in a circle marked with Hebrew letters and Greek sigils. One of them, a scholar by day, but a magus by night, raises a wooden wand and traces a pentagram in the air. As he chants the names of the planetary spirits invoking the authority of Hermes Isis and the sun god Ra, the flickering gaslight seems to dim, and the space between the walls begins to feel vast and ancient. This is the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn. Here, in the heart of the British Empire, the ancient mysteries are being resurrected, categorized, and practiced with the precision of a laboratory experiment. The occult revival was fueled by the golden age of archaeology and the birth of comparative mythology. Discoveries in Egypt and Mesopotamia were bringing the names of forgotten deities back into common parlance. At the same time, the British presence in India introduced Westerners to the Vedas and the concept of prana, or life force. Figures like Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, argued that there was a secret doctrine underlying all religions, a perennial wisdom that had been guarded by hidden masters. This idea provided the intellectual framework for modern paganism, the belief that by looking backward one could find a more authentic, powerful way of being. Central to this revival was the creation of secret societies, the most influential of which was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in 1888. The Golden Dawn did something revolutionary for the history of paganism. It synthesized everything. It took the Kabbalah from Judaism, the gods of Egypt, the rituals of Freemasonry, and the philosophy of the Renaissance Magi, and wove them into a single cohesive system of magic. This was not the folk paganism of the countryside, but a high magic for the urban intellectual. The gods were viewed as archetypes, forces of the collective unconscious that could be tapped into to achieve self-realization. This era also saw the rise of individuals who became the bridge between the old wise women and the modern practitioner. In France, Eliphas Levi redefined the image of the Baphomet, transforming it into a symbol of universal equilibrium rather than a demonic idol. In England, Aleister Crowley, the Great Beast, pushed the boundaries of the occult even further. Crowley's philosophy of thelema centered on the law, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," was a radical departure from Christian morality, and a return to the sovereign individuality of the ancient hero. While often sensationalized, Crowley's work was deeply scholarly, based on a rigorous study of ancient Greek and Egyptian ritual. He brought a sense of danger and raw primal energy back to the idea of the old gods. Parallel to this high magic was the folk revival. In the late 1800s, folklorists like Sir James Frazer published The Golden Bough, a massive multi-volume work that traced the common threads of sacrifice, the dying god, and the sacred king across all human cultures. Frazer's work was intended to be a scientific critique of religion, but for the budding pagan, it served as an encyclopedia of ritual. It suggested that underneath the veneer of modern life, the king of the wood was still waiting in the shadows. The idea of the vegetation spirit, or the corn mother, became a powerful imaginative force, linking the modern city dweller to the biological reality of the harvest. This period also saw the first stirrings of asatru, or heathenry, in Germany and Scandinavia. Influenced by the Romantic movement, scholars and mystics began to recreate the rituals of the Norse and Germanic tribes, often linking them to a search for national identity. While some of these movements would later be co-opted by the dark politics of the early 20th century, their origin was a genuine desire to reconnect with the ancestral soul and the gods of the northern landscape, Odin, Thor, and the world tree. The occult revival was a crucial incubation period. It took the fragmented, often misunderstood remnants of the pagan past and gave them a structure, a vocabulary, and a sense of dignity. It proved that one could be a person of the modern age, a scientist, a poet, or a doctor, and still find truth in the worship of the moon or the invocation of the gods. The many were no longer just curiosities in a museum. They were becoming the foundation of a new spiritual identity. However, the Golden Dawn and its contemporaries were still mostly ceremonial. They were rituals of the lodge and the library. What was missing was the return to the earth itself. The next step in the journey would involve moving the magic out of the drawing room and back into the forest. It would require a synthesis of the high magic of the occultists and the folk wisdom of the cunning man. The stage was set for the 20th century, where a retired civil servant named Gerald Gardner would step out of the shadows and claim to have found a witch cult that had survived since the Stone Age. The old religion was about to go public. The Green Rebirth, Gerald Gardner Wicca, and the 20th century. As the world emerged from the shadow of the Second World War, a period of profound social and spiritual upheaval began. The old certainties of the Victorian era had been shattered by the mechanical horrors of the early 20th century, and a new generation began to look toward the past for a source of healing and ecological sanity. In 1951, the last of the British Witchcraft Act's laws that had for centuries forbidden the practice of magic was finally repealed. In the wake of this new freedom, a retired civil servant named Gerald Gardner stepped forward with a startling claim that the old religion of the pre-Christian world had never actually died. It had survived in the shadows passed down through secret lineages of the Wicca and was now ready to return to the light of the modern day. The summer air in the New Forest of England is heavy and still fragrant with the scent of wild garlic and the musk of damp bracken. Deep within a private grove, where the canopy of ancient oaks creates a cathedral of living green, a circle is cast. It is not marked with the complex symbols of the Victorian occultists, but with a simple cord and the rhythmic tread of bare feet upon the earth. A woman representing the high priestess stands before a low stone altar adorned with a bowl of salt, a chalice of water, and a sprig of rowan. She raises a black-handled knife, the athame, toward the rising moon, invoking the Great Mother, who is known as Isis, Astarte, and Diana. Beside her, a man invokes the horned god of the wildwood. There is no sense of the clinical or the scholarly here. Instead, there is a raw, joyous connection to the cycles of the body and the breath of the planet. In this quiet clearing, the country dweller has returned no longer as a peasant hiding in the dark, but as a modern seeker reclaiming their ancestral birthright. Gerald Gardner's Wicca was a revolutionary synthesis. He drew upon the ceremonial magic of the Golden Dawn, the folk traditions of the British Isles, and the theories of Margaret Murray, an anthropologist who argued that the medieval witch trials were actually a persecution of a surviving pagan fertility religion. While modern historians have debated the literal accuracy of Murray's witch cult theory, its emotional and spiritual power was undeniable. Gardner provided a framework for a religion that was decentralized, nature-centered, and most significantly, one that elevated the feminine principle to an equal status with the masculine. In an era of rigid patriarchal structures, the return of the goddess was a spiritual earthquake. This green rebirth coincided with the birth of the modern environmental movement and the rise of second-wave feminism. To many, the Abrahamic faiths felt like religions of the city and the law, while Wicca and its sister paths offered a religion of the forest and the heart. The goddess became a symbol of the earth itself, nurturing, fierce, and cyclical. The horned god was reimagined not as the Christian devil, but as the lord of the dance, the spirit of animal life, and the sacrifice that sustains the harvest. This was a paganism of embodiment, celebrating the sacredness of the physical world, the beauty of the seasons, and the wisdom of the senses. As the 1960s and 70s progressed, the movement expanded beyond Gardner's original vision. In the United States, figures like Starhawk blended neo-paganism with social activism, using ritual as a tool for political and ecological change. In California and the Pacific Northwest, eco-paganism took root, viewing the protection of the redwoods and the oceans as a religious duty. This era also saw the rise of Druidry as a modern spiritual path. No longer a secret society for male antiquarians, modern Druidry became an open experiential path focused on the Awen, the divine inspiration found in poetry, nature, and the creative spirit. Groups like the Order of Bards Ovates and Druids Obad began to perform ceremonies at Stonehenge and in private groves, honoring the land and the ancestors. The 20th century revival also addressed the concept of Reconstructionism. While Wicca was an inspired tradition, a creative blend of old and new other paths sought to be as historically accurate as possible. Heathenry, modern Norse, and Germanic paganism saw a massive growth focusing on the study of the Eddas and the practice of the blot and symbol. These practitioners sought to reclaim the virtues of the Viking Age hospitality, courage, and loyalty within a modern context. Similarly, Hellenismos, Greek Reconstructionism, and Religio Romana, Roman Reconstructionism, began to emerge with devotees performing ancient rituals to the Olympians and the Lares, often in the very landscapes where those gods were first named. What set 20th century paganism apart from all that came before was its pluralism. For the first time in history, the many gods were not just the gods of one's local tribe or city. They were part of a global interconnected community of practice. A practitioner in London might feel a deep connection to the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, while a seeker in New York might honor the Irish Morrigan. This global paganism was facilitated by the rise of the Internet, which allowed solitary practitioners, once known as hedge witches, to find common ground, share rituals, and build an international movement. The legacy of this era is the normalization of the pagan identity. By the end of the century, paganism had moved from the fringe of the occult into the mainstream of the spiritual but not religious landscape. It provided a sanctuary for those who sought a connection to the earth without the requirements of a central dogma or a human-led hierarchy. The Word had been challenged by the earth, and the One had been rejoined by the many. As we move into the 21st century, the history of paganism is no longer a story of survival or revival. It is a story of living presence. The ancient storyteller has found a new audience, and the rituals that were once performed in the shadows of the Roman Pagus are now being performed on suburban lawns and digital screens. The country dweller has become a citizen of a global ecological village, and the gods are no longer sleeping. They are awake watching as humanity faces its greatest challenge yet. The Hearth of the Future, Polytheism in the 21st Century. The journey that began in the lightless depths of Paleolithic caves wound through the marble halls of Rome and survived in the whispered folklore of the medieval village has reached the present day. We live in an era of unprecedented technological power, a digital age where the collective knowledge of humanity is available at the touch of a screen. Yet in this world of glass and silicon, the ancient call of the pagan heart is louder than it has been in 1,000 years. Modern paganism is no longer a collection of scattered ghosts. It is a vibrant, global, and highly sophisticated spiritual landscape that offers a unique answer to the crises of the modern soul. The cool blue light of a computer monitor flickers in a quiet apartment in a bustling metropolis. Outside, the hum of traffic and the neon glow of the city create a world of constant motion and noise. On the screen, a group of people from 4 different continents are gathered in a digital circle, their faces small windows into diverse lives. At the center of the desk beside the keyboard sits a small handmade bowl of water and a single beeswax candle. As the participants begin to recite a prayer to the spirits of the land, honoring the ancestors of the soil, they each stand upon the artificial glare of the room seems to soften. They are not escaping the modern world. They are re-enchanting it. They are using the tools of the future to reclaim a relationship with the timeless. In this moment, the ancient paganess has become the digital nomad, finding the sacred not in a distant past, but in the immediate breathing reality of a planet that still turns regardless of the satellites that circle it. In the 21st century, paganism has moved beyond the identity crisis of the earlier revival years. While the 20th century was preoccupied with proving the historical truth of its lineages, the modern practitioner often embraces a more nuanced perspective. This is the era of living tradition. Whether one is a Druid, a heathen, a Wiccan, or a practitioner of Hellenismos, the focus has shifted from "where did this come from?" to "how does this help me live a life of meaning and integrity today?" This pragmatism is a hallmark of the pagan spirit. It is a religion of practice, rather than belief, of action, rather than dogma. One of the most significant developments in the current era is the deepening of ecological theology. As humanity faces the existential threat of climate change, the pagan reverence for the earth has transformed from a romantic aesthetic into a spiritual imperative. For the modern pagan, the sacredness of nature is not a metaphor. It is a biological and spiritual fact. This has led to a surge in animism, the recognition that we live in a world of persons, only some of whom are human. By treating the river, the forest, and the atmosphere as beings with their own rights and spirits, paganism provides a moral framework for sustainability that is rooted in relationship rather than regulation. The social structure of modern paganism has also matured. We are seeing the establishment of formal institutions such as the Pagan Federation and the rise of professional pagan chaplaincy in hospitals, prisons, and the military. In many countries, paganism is now a legally recognized religion with the same rights as the Abrahamic faiths. This institutionalization brings challenges such as the tension between the inherent wildness of the path and the requirements of the law, but it also provides a sense of community and support for a new generation of practitioners. Furthermore, the 21st century has seen a powerful move toward inclusive polytheism. Modern practitioners are increasingly focused on ensuring that their paths are welcoming to all, regardless of race, gender, or orientation. The many gods are seen as a perfect mirror for a many-peopled world. This has led to a rejection of the Völkisch or exclusionary ideologies that occasionally plagued earlier revivals, replaced by a Hearth culture that emphasizes hospitality and the shared humanity of all who seek the old ways. The gods, after all, have always been travelers, crossing borders and merging with new cultures for millennia. The hearth of the future is also a place of synthesis. We see the rise of science-positive paganism, where practitioners find the divine in the deep time of geology, the complexity of DNA, and the vastness of the cosmos as revealed by modern telescopes. There is no conflict here between the laboratory and the altar. Both are tools for exploring the mystery of existence. The ancient Greek philosophers who sought the Logos would recognize this marriage of reason and wonder. As we look toward the horizon, the history of paganism teaches us one fundamental truth: the old gods never truly leave. They are the personifications of the permanent forces of the universe, the sun that warms the skin, the storm that breaks the drought, the love that creates life, and the death that clears the way for the new. They are the language our ancestors used to describe the awe of being alive, and they remain available to anyone who is willing to listen to the wind or watch the moon rise with an open heart. The story of paganism is the story of humanity's long, beautiful, and sometimes difficult conversation with the earth. It is a story that does not end with a final chapter, but continues with every ritual performed at a backyard altar, every tree planted in a sacred grove, and every child taught to respect the hidden people of the woods. The country dweller is still here, reminding us that no matter how high we build our towers of glass, our feet are still made of clay, and our breath is still a gift from the air. The fires are lit, the circle is open but unbroken. The ancient storyteller has finished their tale for tonight, but the stars are still moving, and the earth is still dreaming. The future of paganism is not a return to the past, but a journey into a more enchanted, respectful, and conscious future. The eternal return, synthesis, and the global spirit. As we stand at the precipice of a new era, the story of paganism reaches a point of profound synthesis. We have seen the gods rise in the dawn of the Fertile Crescent retreat, into the folklore of the medieval hearth and re-emerge through the intellectual fire of the Renaissance and the Romantic soul. But the 21st century has brought something entirely new, a global consciousness where the ancient local spirits are meeting a planetary reality. The history of paganism is no longer a linear path of decline or revival. It has become a vast interconnected ecosystem of belief that is helping humanity navigate the transition into an uncertain future. The night sky over a remote mountain range is a deep velvety black, salted with 1 billion distant suns. There is no city light here to dim the majesty of the Milky Way, which arches across the heavens like the spine of a great celestial beast. Standing on a high ridge, a group of people from vastly different backgrounds, scientists, artists, farmers, and teachers, gather around a small contained fire. They do not speak. They listen to the wind as it whistles through the crags and watch the sparks from the cedar wood rise toward the constellations. They are here for a global ritual, coordinated across time zones to honor the turning of the great year. In their pockets they carry stones from their home soils. In their hearts they carry the names of 1,000 different gods. But as they look up at the stars, they feel a singular, overwhelming truth: they are not separate from this vastness. They are the universe experiencing itself through the eyes of the country dweller. The ancient pagan impulse to find the sacred in the immediate has finally expanded to include the entire cosmos. This final stage of our journey is defined by universalism and localization. While the Internet has created a global pagan community, it has also sparked a renewed interest in the ancestors of the land. Modern practitioners are increasingly looking at the specific history of the ground beneath their feet, honoring the indigenous spirits and the forgotten histories of their local regions. This is a healed paganism, one that seeks to acknowledge the scars of the past while building a sustainable spiritual future. It is a recognition that while the names of the gods may vary, the soil that sustains us is a singular, shared miracle. The 21st century also sees the rise of techno-paganism and scientific animism. As our understanding of quantum physics and ecology deepens, the old superstitions are being reimagined as sophisticated metaphors for the way reality actually works. When a pagan speaks of the web of life, the modern biologist sees the intricate trophic cascades of an ecosystem. When a practitioner speaks of energy, the physicist sees the vibration of strings and the flow of particles. This synthesis of the mystical and the empirical is the hearth of the future. It allows the modern person to be fully grounded in the facts of the 20th century, while remaining fully open to the mystery of the eternal. The objective of this long-form history has been to show that paganism is not a relic of the past, but a vital evolving part of the human story. It is the root system of our spiritual life. Just as a forest relies on the hidden network of mycelium to share nutrients and warnings, humanity relies on the pagan spirit to maintain its connection to the earth. The many have always been here, providing a pluralistic, tolerant, and diverse framework for understanding the divine. In a world often torn apart by the one truth, the pagan many truths offer a path of peace and coexistence. As we extinguish the last candle of this documentary, we return to the quiet visual moment that began our journey. The hand on the cave wall, the priest on the ziggurat, the druid in the grove, they are all still here within us. The entire history of paganism is ultimately your history. It is the story of how we learn to love the world, to fear its power, and to celebrate its beauty. The gods are not in the books. They are in the breath. The altar is not in the temple, it is in the heart. The journey does not end here. It continues every time you stop to admire the moon, every time you plant a seed with intention, and every time you stand in awe of the mystery of being alive. The forest and the flame will burn as long as there are humans to tend the hearth. The gods are waiting. The earth is breathing. The circle is open.